holding on Daf Tes Amid Beis, all the way on the bottom at the new parak, 9b5.
The new Mishnah, correct.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we just finished discussing at what time of the years did they withdraw money from the lishcha, from the chamber of where the shekels were. And now we're going to talk about exactly what is the money used for. Okay, we got the machzan shekel, we've collected the shekalim. What are they used for? So, says the Mishnah, ha-teruma ma hayu oisaba. The teruma, meaning the money taken from the shekalim, okay, that was removed. Teruma means upshiding, separating, right? That was separated from the pile of money. What was it used for? So it says the Mishnah, like chimba tamimim u'misafim, we use it to purchase the daily carbon tomids and the additional offerings. Okay, on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh and the Rosh Regalim, all the extra kabbanis, all of which have one common denominator, that they're all carbon sibors. They're all communal offerings. So we're taking from the communal money, which is, of course, the shekalim, and we're purchasing with it communal offerings. And therefore, uniskayim, and the nisachim, the wine libations, and the grain libations that come along with it. Ha'omer, the omer that was brought on the 16th of Nisan, on the first day of Chalamoid, as we would know it in Eretz Yisrael, which then allowed Klal Yisrael to start eating chulin from the chadash, from the new grains that were now sprouting. Ushtei lechem, and the two loaves, i.e. the two loaves that were brought on Shavuos, which allowed chadash to now be used for truma, and to allow us to be used chadash for kachim in the Beis Hamikdash. They were, of course, waved around. Uvelechem aponim, the showbread, the ponim bread that was put on the golden shulchan, the shulchan azav in the Beis Hamikdash. The shulchan azav. Good morning, Charlie. We're in the Mishnah on 9b5.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 sec.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Let me just get it 1 sec.
Okay, we're on Tes Amid Beis, 9b5, all the way on the bottom. Okay.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start quickly the Mishnah again, only because it's important. This, as opposed to the previous parak, which talked about the times of the year that we took out money, we withdrew money from the bank, known as the lishcha, where the money, the shekalim were staying. This Mishnah says, what do I do with the money? So again, ha-teruma, the separating of the money from the pile. Ma haya oisimba, what was done with it? Like chimba tamimim u'misafim, we purchased the daily carbon tamid of the morning and the afternoon, and the musafim, and the extra things that's for Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, and the Shalosh Regalim. All of them have one common denominator, that they are communal offerings. We're using the communal money that we collected, the shekalim, which is communal money, and we're using it to purchase carbon sibors, communal offerings. And therefore, the niskayim and the nisachim that come along with it, the wine libations, etc. Ha'omer that was brought on the 16th of Nisan, which then allowed us to use chadash, the new grains in the upcoming year. And the shtei lechem, and the two loaves. These are the two loaves that were brought on Shavuos that allowed chadash to be used in the Beis Hamikdash. And again, all of these are communal in nature. The lechem aponim, the bread that was used on the shulchan, the golden table that was replaced every Shabbos, which again was a communal offering, as it were, to be put on the shulchan. B'kol kabbanis hatzibur, and all kabbanis tzibur that were offered among the years. This comes to include any extra stuff that was done during the day and on Yom Kippur. Okay, says the Gemara Baita, the Mishnah Baita, Shomerei Sefichin B'Shvius. Those who watch the Sefichin, the aftergrowths of the Shemitah year. What is this talking about? Everybody knows the seventh year is the year of Shemitah. Now, all things that grow, you're not allowed to cultivate the grains in the field during the seventh year. Not only that, you're not allowed to guard them. They have to be open to all, because all the grains that grow by themselves are a din of hefker, are ownerless, and anybody can come and take them. So here's the problem. Because even in the seventh year, I have to bring the omer on the 16th of Nisan in order to free, because that's a chiyuv d'oraisa. And I have to bring the shtei halechem on Shavuos. But how am I going to bring it if it's ownerless? So they would go ahead and they would put shomrim, watchmen, on a certain amount of the grains, the new grains that were coming, and they would tell people, please don't take from that, because we need it for the Beis Hamikdash, for the Omer. So they had to put a watchman on it. It says the Mishnah, Shomer Sefichin B'Shvius, those who watch the aftergrowth on Shavuos, Noitlan Secharon, they take their salaries, we're on 9b6, Mitrumas Halishcha, from the funds of the chamber as well. Why? Because obviously these aftergrowths, which are being watched, are for the use of the Omer, which is a communal offering. Rabbi Yosi says, no. Af haroitza misnadev shemechina. Those who wish to volunteer to watch the aftergrowth, they're allowed to. Okay? What does this mean in a second? It seems like a very nice thing that he said. It's not. It's actually an argument. Amrullah said the Tanakama, the sages, to Rabbi Yosi, after Omer she'ein boyin elo on Yuram and Aleph 10a1 Michel Tzibor, all that it must come from public funds. What's going on here? What's going on over here is, and the Gemara is about to get into this, a fundamental machlokes. The Tanakama holds that things that are going to be used for communal offerings cannot originally, lichatchila, be owned by an individual. In other words, it's communal, it must be a non-profit, and therefore an individual can never own it. So in the case of Shavuos, where I have to guard the aftergrowth, and the aftergrowth is hefker, ownerless, I tell the guardman, the guard, watch this tour. Do not take ownership of it. We're going to pay you to stand guard, to tell everybody, please don't pick this tavua because we need it for the Omer. Rabbi Yosi says, no. It's okay if somebody takes ownership of it on an individual basis and then turns around and is minad of it, donates it for the public use. It's okay for me to go from private use, from private ownership into public ownership. It's all right. So therefore, even if a guy wants to simply donate his time to watch it, which therefore, because he's not being paid, we're worried about that what he's going to do in order to protect this thing. He's going to take ownership of this ownerless tivua grains, and then subsequently, after taking ownership, right? Saying, I'm now turning around and donating it to the Beis HaMikdash for the public use for the Yomer. According to Rabbi Yossi, this is not a problem. That's why you don't have to pay him. You can even have donated. Chazal say, no, that's a major problem. If it's a public use, it can never have a private ownership from the beginning. And therefore, we want to pay them from the public funds, so they work for the public, so that they're simply going to watch and never take ownership, and therefore we will never have this problem. Okay, says the Gemara, Ma ro zaman atzei kahanim va'om lihimonis. The Mishnah says like this. There's a Mishnah in Tainus that says that when Ezra Sefer came up, 9 families of Kahanim went ahead and contributed the Atzei HaMizbeach, the wood for the Mizbeach, to burn the Kabbanis for the second Beis HaMikdash. They were the ones to initially offer wood in order to get the Beis HaMikdash starting again. They were praised, and each one of the 9 families established a day upon which their original ancestors had donated the wood. They established a Yom Tov for themselves. One of these families, in fact, established it on Yud B'Av, the day after Tisha B'Av. The day after Tisha B'Av was the day that their ancestors had contributed wood for the Maracha, for the pyre to burn the Kabbanis, and they turned that into a holiday. So, Freit the Gemara, Ma'ro Zaman, why did the Mishnah in Tainus go out of its way to count the 9 dates on which specific families, Kahanim family, donated woods? In fact, any private citizen could donate wood at any time he wished. Says the Gemara, Elo b'shah she'olu Yisrael min haGoyla, when Klal Yisrael went up from Bovel, back in the times of the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, back to Eretz Yisrael, lo matzu eitzim b'lishcha, they had no wood in the Beis HaMikdash's wooden chamber. Va'amdu olev v'nisnavnu eitzim mishal atzman, and these 9 families rose and they volunteered to contribute wood of their own, uvisarim letzibur, and they transferred the wood from their private ownership into the public ownership. And so what do you see from here? That number 1, like Rabbi Yossi, you can contribute from private and donate for public use. And the Kahanim would use this wood to offer up the communal offerings. And in recognition of this, the Nevi'im of the time, as Ezra Sefer and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah went ahead and established for these families in future years, even if the lishka, the chamber, is full of wood, these families will arise and will be allowed to contribute wood of their own on those days, on the days of their families, Yom Tov, the days when their original ancestors donated the wood at that time. The offerings will be brought except from their woods first. In any case, that you're allowed to transfer from private ownership into public use for public offerings. Just like who? Amar Rabacha, the Rabbi Yossi. This Mishnah in Tainus is going according to our opinion about Rabbi Yossi over here in Shekalim. The Rabbi Yossi Armel, because Rabbi Yossi says, and now we're on 10A2. 10A2. Af haroitze misnadev shemechinam. And also, we're allowed to have a private, you can donate your time to watch the aftergrowth of Shvius in order to use it for the Yomer. Why are we worried about it? Normally, we'd say a private person who's not hired by the public, he will make, if he really wants to do his job right, Logically, what he's going to do is take ownership of the ownerless aftergrowth and then turn around and donate it. The only one who allows that to happen is Rav Yossi. So says the Gemara, Rav Yosef switched the Rebbe Yossi to Rav Yossi. This is an Amoira, not a Tana. Rav Yosef, B'Shem Rabbi Ilah, Divrei HaKol. He ends the Mishnah in Tainus actually is going to everybody, even Chazal. Ma pligi, and what are they arguing whether private property can be subsequently transferred into public funds for the use of the public? Begufay shel carbon. They're talking about the actual carbon, the actual sacrifice, the actual offering, the animal or the grain, the animal or the grain with regard to the omer. An animal isn't brought, the grain is brought. Ava machshirei carbon, but the ancillary stuff, that's for the carbon, the preliminary stuff, similar to the knife that's used for the bris milah, right, and all the other stuff, or the gauzes, or anything else that's brought along, right, ava machshirei carbon, such as the wood being burnt on the mizbeach, because you obviously need the wood to offer up the carbon. But the wood itself is ancillary to the actual carbon. Kol ama moida shehu mishtana carbon yachal carbon tzibur. All could admit that you're allowed to have private ownership, which can subsequently be transferred into the public offering, public thing. Okay, says the Gemara, Tani, Isha she'asa kesainis levinah. A woman who makes a coat or a tunic for her Kohen Gadol son to wear while serving in the Beis Hamikdash, Keshera. It's allowed. Novad shedemisrana letzibur. As long as she transfers the ownership of the cloak from her private ownership into the public domain. Because the Kohen Gadol, when he's in the Beis Hamikdash, right, by definition, is a public person. He's the Rav. He's the thing. He's not a private person. So the Tana of this Tosefta clearly holds that you're allowed to transfer privately owned stuff into the public ownership to be used in the avoid of the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Rav Acha de Rav Yossi. This is the Rav Yossi of our Mishnah. The Rav Yossi Afa writes a misnadev shemechina, that they could watch the aftergrowth even as a private person. And even if they take ownership, they can subsequently transfer it to the public domain. Says Rav Yosef, the Amora, B'Shem Rabbi Loi, Divrei HaKol. That Paraisa goes according to everybody. Ma pligin, where they arguing, Begufay shel carbon, the actual carbon. Ava machshirei carbon, the machshirei carbon. For an example, the tunic worn by the Kohen while he's serving the Beis Hamikdash, Kol Ama Moideshu Mistane Carbon Yochid the Carbon Tzibur, all can admit that it may be transferred from an individual's offering to a public offering. Of course, this is very schwer to understand, because the Kohen Gadol is only allowed to wear the godim that the Torah says that he's allowed to wear to do the service in the Beis Hamikdash. So what's pshat in this tunic? This tunic is not being used for public uses in the Beis Hamikdash. Elamai, what you have to say, it's a sweater. It's a sweater that the Kohen Gadol's mother made for him. She didn't want him to catch a cold, so that has a public use. We don't want our Kohen Gadol catching a cold and being unable to use to do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. This is very similar to a story with my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Pam, the Rosh Yeshiva of Zecheni Levracha of Tevedas, who actually was a Kohen himself, Avraham Yaakov HaKohen Pam. He used to have this ugly, ugly green sweater that he used to wear every day. This ugly green sweater that he wore every day, it was terrible. I think it even had a hole in it twice. So finally we asked him, the Talmidim asked him, Rebbe, why don't you just get a new sweater? So he said as follows. when I was 15 years old or thereabout, my mother bought me this sweater. And she said, Abraham, when it's cold outside, wear this sweater. So he turned to us close to 60 years later and said, so that when it's cold outside, I wear this sweater. What a lesson in life about kibbutz. It's very similar to this Gemara that we just learned. So now, says the Gemara, Masnisi Pligi Rav Yosi. We have a Baraisa that disputes the explanation of Rav Yosi in the name of Rabbi Lloyd, the Amora Rav Yosi, and how he's been explaining things. We said that these 9 families got 9 private holidays for themselves in honor of the fact that their ancestors were the first to donate wood, including one of them on the 10th day of Av. Says the Gemara, Oisa Yomi, those days that were celebrated as Yom Tovim, Nahagin b'shas korban u'b'shaloi b'shas korban, were celebrated at the time when the kabbanis were brought, i.e. when the Beis Hamikdash was Kayim, u'shaloi b'shas korban, or when the kabbanis were not brought, even when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing. Rabbi Yosi said, Einin nahagis ela b'shas korban b'vad. They were only celebrated at the time when the kabbanis were brought, i.e. only when the Beis Hamikdash was standing. Now, both views agree that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the families would celebrate their respective wood donations as Yom Tovim, Asering, fasts, and eulogies. On those days, such an importance can only be lent to those days if the wood is deemed an actual offering, not just a preliminary to the offering. Because we have a rule that something is not called a Yom Tov, a holiday, unless it has to do with something that's fundamental to the Beis Hamikdash. That's fundamental to the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, since everybody agrees at the time when the Beis Hamikdash was Kaim, they celebrated their Yom Tovs, not being allowed to fast or eulogize on those days. If that's the case, we're not talking about side. You can't just say that they're arguing on the Gufay Shel Carbon, because the wood is considered Gufay Shel Carbon because it has a din of a Yom Tov. And the Gemara says further, V'oi min hadol detanya, and you see what was learned in a Baraisa. Amar Rabbi Eliezer Bei Rabbi Tzaddik, Rabbi Eliezer the son of Rabbi Tzaddik said, On Royin B'nei Sa'on ben Binyamin. We are of the family of Sinah ben Binyamin. We are now on 10A3. 10A3. This is one of the families that donated wood. One of the families that donated wood and got a Yom Tov. V'chal Tisha B'Av liyos b'Shabbos. And our Yom Tov, we are the family whose private Yom Tov is on the 10th of Av. V'chal Tisha B'Av liyos b'Shabbos. And when Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, falls on Shabbos, it gets pushed. V'dochinu, it gets pushed. Oisei l'matzah Shabbos, it gets pushed to after Shabbos, the 10th day of Av on Sunday. V'hainu misanin v'loi mishalmin, and we fasted only part of the day and didn't complete the fast. The senior family did not complete the tainus on the 10th of Av because it was the date of their Yom Tov. Now, the fact that their family was allowed not to fast the whole Tisha B'Av when it was pushed off is a raya that it wasn't simply that the wood was ancillary to the actual offering. It's part and parcel of the offering. So therefore, this that you taught Rabbi Yosi, that the machlokes is only in the ancillary, it's only in the Carbon atzma in the actual offering, but the ancillary could even come from private ownership and be transferred to the public domain, cannot be the answer. The fact that it's been called a yontif, and we have a family that was able to use that yontif even on the major fast day like Tisha B'Av, even when it's pushed off to only fast a half a day, because obviously it's not ancillary, but it's part of it itself, which means that we clearly have an argument. We clearly have an argument on every part of it. On the wood is considered as part of the carbon itself, right? Says further. The Mishnah says further. Ha'omer v'shtei halechem v'lechem ha'panim v'chol kabani satzibur. The omer, the 2 loaves, the panim bread, and all the public offerings were purchased with funds withdrawn from the lishcha, the trumas lishcha that was holding the shekalim. Now, we're talking about the omer. The omer, we just said, especially with regard to shvius, is it had to come from the aftergrowth on shvius. It had to come from lands that were Eretz Yisrael. Now, David HaMelech captured most of the land of Syria, all the way up to Aleppo, Syria. Okay? When he captured all the lands in Syria, from Aleppo, Syria, he also went ahead and incorporated those lands into greater Israel, greater Eretz Yisrael. Almost up to the gates of Damascus was controlled by David HaMelech. Nonetheless, the Yidden did not all agree with David HaMelech with the kibush haaretz of Syria. So says the Mishnah over here, Masnisin de Rabbi Yishmael. This Mishnah follows Rabbi Yishmael. The Rabbi Yishmael Omer Omer. Eina Omer ba min Syria. The Omer is not allowed to come from Syria. And the reason for this is because if this was the case, it would be no problem. Syria is not Eretz Yisrael proper, but since it was incorporated by David HaMelech, we would have been able to go take the tefillah from there. Because Shemitah is only Negeya in Eretz Yisrael itself. By the fact that we do not go to Syria to take the tefillah to use for the Omer, it's because you cannot take barley for the Omer, you coming from Syria. Tana Tanina, we learned in a Mishnah in Menachos, Kol Karbonos HaYachid VaTzibur, all grains for private and public use, Karbonos, meal, grain offerings, Bayim mina aretz and mina chutzlaretz, can come from the land and from outside the land. Mina chodosh and mina yoshan, from the new crop or old crop. Chutz, except ha'oime v'shtei halechem, the oime and the two lechem, which she'ein bayin ela mina chodosh and mina aretz, which comes only from the new crop and from the land. Since both the oime and the shtei halechem are coming to be matir, to allow us to use the new grains for the upcoming year. That's the Omer of the 16th of Nisan. And in the Beis HaMikdash, the Shtei Halechem, they have to come from good Omer. Where do those grains have to come from? From Israel proper. Rav Chuna b'shem Rav Yirmiyah, Rav said in the name of Rav Yirmiyah, the Rabbi Yishmael, the stiff or the fowls of Yishmael, the Omer Rabbi Yishmael, Omar the Rabbi Yishmael Omar Eina Omer Bod min Syria, that the barley cannot come from Syria, cannot come from there because we're not going over there to take it. We need it to come from Eretz Yisrael proper. Tana Tanina, we learned in a Mishnah, Ese Kedusha saying there are 10 levels of holiness. Eretz Yisrael mikudeshes mikol haratzos. Eretz Yisrael is more holy than all other lands. Mahi Kedushasa. What is the nature of its holiness? We bring from the barley, from the omer, the fruits of the bikurim and the wheat for the shtei halechem, come from things that are grown in Eretz Yisrael proper and not from other lands. Rab Chia b'shem Rab Yirmiyah, Rab Chia says in the name of Rab Yirmiyah, we are now on 10A4. 10A4. Al Kachach Rabbi Yishmael. We're talking about Rabbi Yishmael. The Rabbi Yishmael, Omar Eino Omer Ba Min Assyria, that it cannot come from Syria. Tana Tinin, we got a third Mishnah that follows Rabbi Yishmael as well, regarding the two Isurim on Shabbos of plowing and reaping on Shabbos. That means plowing up the ground, and then reaping and cutting off the growths on Shabbos. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, just like plowing is a rishus, it's discretionary, meaning you can go your whole life without plowing. No one ever said you have to plow. I have never plowed in my life. But if you plow, you're not allowed to plow on Shabbos. So reaping, cutting the tvua is also discretionary, meaning you can go your whole life without cutting any tvua. But if you're going to cut, therefore it's asur. But that means that the issa d'oraisa is only on discretionary, but an obligated reaping, i.e. lamashal, for the omer is permitted on Shabbos. Yotza kitzira omer shuhu mitzvah. The reaping of the omer, which is a commandment, is an obligated, you're obligated to cut it the morning of the 16th, is excluded from this Isser, because asay doiche loisasay, the asay, the positive commandment of bringing the omer, of reaping and bringing the omer, pushes aside is doiche, the loisasay of Shabbos, of the lav of reaping, of the prohibition of reaping. Rabbi Yishmael bedate, and Rabbi Yishmael agrees, Rabbi Yishmael agrees, the Rabbi Yishmael da'ama ein omer bo min asuya. Kedate da'ama yotze kitzira omer shu mitzvah. Follows his opinion that the reaping of the omer, which is an obligatory mitzvah, is excluded from the Isser on Shabbos. So therefore, I might have thought that in Shemitah, since Shemitah I'm not allowed to have any ownership or grow things from Syria, and so grow things in Eretz Yisrael. So I might worry I might not have any tevuah to take, to reap, to use for the omer, which I must also bring, irrespective of the fact that it's Shavuos, which might have allowed me to say, well, let me go to Syria, the areas that David HaMelech captured, and take from there tevuah, because this way I will be sure that I have tevuah to bring for the omer, even though it's Shavuos. Kamash Malon, then no, we push off the prohibition. We push off the prohibition of reaping the Shavuos stuff, even from Eretz Yisrael, in order to fulfill the obligatory mitzvah of bringing the omer. Man Tana, says the Gemara Vaita, Man Tana Shoymei Sefichis B'Shvius Noitos Secharem Mitrumas Halishcha. Who taught that those who are watching the aftergrowth of Shvius for Bezdin, in order to make sure that we have tevuah, we have grains available for the omer, get paid from the Trumas Halishcha, right? So, and for the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel, it has to be Rabbi Shmuel, that the stalks used in the omer, the Shnei Alechem, are now allowed to be imported from outside Eretz Yisrael, and therefore we're forced to permit guarding these stalks on the Shemitah year, even though normally you're not allowed to guard. Normally you're not allowed to put up a fence or do any guarding of tevuah, of automatic growth on Shavuos. It has to be completely ownerless, which means it has to be available to everybody. In fact, it could be everybody. That you cannot find in Syria the omer barley and the two shnei alechem that must be brought from Svichen in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, everybody agrees, al karchach, we have to take the grains from Eretz Yisrael, And therefore, in order to make sure that we have no choice but to guard them. And if we're going to guard them, we're allowed to pay them because we have no eligible stalks in Syria. Either the growths of Syria are inferior to the growths of Eretz Yisrael, or two, by the time you cut the grains in Syria and you bring it all the way to Yerushalayim, they won't be fresh anymore, and therefore you won't be able to bring them for the Omer. So therefore now we've learned that in case of necessity, where it's an al karchach, you have no choice to fulfill, and you have to fulfill a positive commandment, all agree that you're permitted to harvest the safifin, the automatic aftergrowth on the Shemitah year for the Omer. Now the Gemara wants to say, if this is a different case, for the purpose of the Omer, yes, you're telling me that I'm allowed to go ahead and harvest and reap and guard the automatic aftergrowth of Shvius. What happens if I'm so afraid we're not going to have aftergrowths? There's so many poor people. They're all going to come and grab all the aftergrowths. Am I allowed to plant grains, seeds, so that we're guaranteed that we'll have new grains to use for, new barley to use for the Omer? This is more. This is not automatic aftergrowths from previous year's pollination. This is me going and planting deliberately on the 7th year on Shavuos. Am I allowed to do this in order to go ahead and have the growths to have what I need to fulfill the positive commandment of the Omer and the Shnei Alechem? Rabbi Chia bar Ada boyi kamei de Ramona. Rabbi Chia bar Ada asked this question to Ramona, and he said like this: didn't we find, isn't this similar to the case of a mincha, a grain, a meal offering, whereas we take our fingers and we scoop our fingers with the 3 fingers and we scoop them like this in order to, we take the kmitza. Now, after I take the kmitza, the remaining flour is supposed to be able to go to the kahanim for their use, for their bread. The question is as follows. What happens after I take the kmitza? What happens when the rest of the grain, the rest of the meal becomes unable to be eaten because it became tameh? The halacha in that case is that the kmitza becomes tameh as well, and the mincha offering is invalid. So therefore, in our case, the kaimitz of the omer flour on 10A5, the kaimitz of the omer flour intentionally planted during Shemitah would also not be valid, since the remainder of the offerings remain prohibited. Hello, Daddy. No problem. We're still in the middle of the daf. We're on the bottom of daf Yud Amud Aleph, if you want to join. Okay, we're on 10A5. Yes, I'm on now. 10A5, exactly. 10A5, okay? Daf Yud Amud Aleph, all the way on the bottom. The last 10A5, okay? Very good. Okay, let me continue. No problem. Okay. So, Amale. So, therefore, we should say we got the same problem, because if I plant on my own, on Shvius, barley for the Omer, which normally I'm not allowed to plant on Shvius, but I do it. Why do I do it? Because I want to guarantee that I have grains to fulfill the mitzvah saseh, the obligatory positive commandment of bringing the Omer Shnei Alechem. But when you grow the grains, you grow a lot of oats, you grow a lot of barley. So the leftover barley that's not being used for the Omer is now going to be illegal. And if it's illegal, it's also to use and that should affect the piece that you did use for the Omer, just like the kaimets that you scooped up with your hand, which that kaimets is tahar, but the remaining grains are tamei, and we say if the remaining grains are tamei, the kaimets becomes no good. Says the Gemara Amalei, says Ramana to Rav Chia bar Abba, it doesn't compare. Nasa b'chamisha devarim shehein boyim b'tumah ve'ein nechlon b'tumah. These, because such grains could be treated as the 5 things that may be brought in a state of tumah, but cannot be eaten b'tumah. And these happen to be the oimer, the shtei alechem, the panim bread, the communal shlomim offerings brought on Shavuos, and the chatas that is brought on Rosh Chodesh, that if tumah is hutra b'tzibor, if the community as a whole is tamei, we have a rule. If everybody's tamei, nobody's tamei. If everybody's tamei, everybody could bring the carbon Pesach, right? So when everybody is tamei, since these are all communal bringings, communal offerings, they could be brought. Since they could be brought, they just can't be eaten, but they could be brought. So clearly the oimer offering is brought in tumah when everybody is tumah. So therefore, even when the remaining of the mincha is prohibited to be eaten, in that case, I don't care if the kemitza. What's the story if the kemitza is tar and everything else is tamei? When everybody's tamei, nothing is tamei. In the case of barley, it's the same thing planted during Shemitah. The minchas oimer would still be valid, even though the remaining of the mincha is prohibited to be eaten, because we have an out of tumah hutra b'tzibor. Very good. So, faith the Gemara, Ketzad Huaisa. Okay, we said we pay the watchman from the Trumas Alishcha, from the funds of that came from the chamber of the Lishcha, the Shekalim's Lishcha. But how do we actually pay them? Do we give them the money directly, or no, we deconcentrate the money and then we give it to them? Says the Gemara, we take money from the bank, the noisin with kaitzin rishonim, and we give it to the harvesters and the watchmen. Before the oimer is brought. Once the oimer is brought at the time on the 16th of Nisan, maybe moyes mitrumas alishcha, we then bring over other monies from the trumas alishcha, from the place where the shekalim were withdrawn, and we deconsecrate the money onto the oimer offering itself. We go ahead and we take the shekalim and we say, these holy shekalim, we're transferring their holiness onto these grains, which are now going to be offered as the oimer. So we transfer it onto another holiness object, and therefore the deconsecrated money can go to repay the bank, which lend us the money in the first place to pay the salaries. So the Gemara, the Tavas came. Are you allowed to do this? The money. Hello, Daddy. Yeah. Oh, so then forget it. So just listen in. All right, we're up to 10A5, the right-hand column. Okay, 10A5. Towards the bottom, about 4 lines from the bottom. So says the Gemara, but is it acceptable? Is it acceptable to be mapped to be poided, to deconsecrate the money in such a way? Can you go ahead and say, pay the salaries for money you borrowed from the bank, and then when you bring the oimer, you take the lishcha money, the shekalim, and you deconsecrate it onto the money. You deconsecrate it onto the oimer, and you say the money is now chulin, which I can pay back the bank, and it's now onto the holiness of the oimer. How can you, what do you call it? The value of the oimer is not equal. is not equal to the value of the flour contained in the offering. It's not equal. The value of the money that you're paying for salaries is more than the value of the omer itself. So it's not a like-to-like transaction. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosi b'shem Rabbi Ba says as follows: Kol ma'ashikiten hein domav mishatz rishayna. No, the salaries are actually pegged to the actual flour that's being used for the Yomer. They're not being paid for watching a much larger amount of barley. They're in fact being paid only for the amount of barley that's being paid, that's being used for the Yomer. So it's a like-to-like transaction. Tana, af pesiche abonim came. Even how we pay the stone workers that help fix the Beis Hamikdash. How do you pay? We don't pay directly from money of the Beis Hamikdash. What do we do? We take money from the bank and we give the money to the quarriers, those who quarry in the stone mine and the stone cutters. Before the stones are set in place on the top row of stones in the building. But when we cement the stones in, maybe we then take money out of the lishcha, the room where the truma, the chamber of the truma of the salishcha of the shkalim, and we deconsecrate the money of the shkalim onto the stones. The stones become holy. The money becomes chulin, and we could use it to pay back the bank. In fact, the Gemara what 10a6, the Tovos came, but is it acceptable to be paid to the money in such a way? But the shkalim are worth more than the bricks. And for the Gemara, Rabbi Yosi b'Rab b'Shem Shmuel, the same answer as before. We actually are paying the stone cutters and the quarry only exactly for the bricks that are being used in the Beis Hamikdash, not for the whole pile of bricks that they were busy with. We're only paying them for exactly what's placed in the Beis Hamikdash exactly. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah on 10b1. Let's just go a little further. Yud Amid Beis, 10b1. The Mishnah continues and says, what else is funded by the shkalim of the Truma Salishcha, of the treasury chamber? The para aduma, because the mei chatos, the water of the chatos in which it's mixed up into, is called a carbon sibor. The Torah uses the lashon carbon sibor with regard to the mei chatos. And we go further, the Sora Mishtaleach, and the Zocha, the he-goat that's sent on Yom Kippur to La Zozel into the Midbar, to be thrown down the mountain, to be mechaper for the sins of Klal Yisrael. The Lashon Shel Zahiris, and the strip of red wool, when the Para Aduma was burned, a strip of red wool was mixed in to the whole concoction. Come from the money to pay for all this comes from the Trumas Alishka, the treasury chamber of the Shkol. Says the Mishnah further, Keves Para, the ramp built to transport the Para Aduma, because the Para Aduma is not allowed to rest its feet on the ground. The Keves Sira Mishtaleach, and the ramp to transport the Sar Mishtaleach to La Zazel, the Lashon Sheben Kanov, and the strip of wool which is tied between its horns, right, which is the strip of wool that turned hopefully white when the he-goat was thrown down the mountain, the Chaper al-Abayim, the Ama Samayim, and the water channel which was the channel of water right outside the Beis Hamikdash, where they would throw out the refuse and the blood and the other stuff, and that channel always had to be upkeep. The city walls and its towers and all the city needs. We are now on 10b2. 10b2. Come from the remainder, the leftover money of the Trumas Alishcha. If you remember, we took out money 3 times a year. We took out money, the first Lishcha, box Aleph, and covered over by leather. Box 2 covered over by leather. Then we used up completely box 3. Then we turned back to the remaining money that was in box 2, and then the remaining money that was in box 1. The remaining monies at the end, this is what they were used for. Abba Shaul says, Kevesh Para, the ramp used to transport the Para Aduma, Kahanim Gedolim Oisim Mishalatzman. The Kahanim Gedolim used to use their own money to build the ramp. It did not come from the money of the Trumas Alishcha of the Shekalim. Moise Shiyore Lishcha Ma Oise Behem. What did they do with the surplus of the remainder of the Shekalim in the Trumas Alishcha? Loitkem Behem Yenoi Shemeinim V'Salsais. So the Tanna Kama says they brought with them wine, oils, and flour, which they then went ahead and resold. So they first used the money to buy wine, oil, and flour, and then they bought it wholesale, and then sold it retail, making a profit. And the profit would go to the Beis Hamikdash. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, Chas v'sholom, ein mistakrin b'shel hegdish. We do not engage in commerce and business with the funds of hegdish. Af loy mishel aniyim. We don't even engage in commerce with funds collected for aniyim. If we make a fund that we collected for aniyim, we do not invest it in the stock market. It has to be put into a money market. It's not allowed to be risked in any which way. Rabbi Akiva says it looks terrible if we use the money. Rabbi Akiva says you're allowed to take something that's hegdish, which became tomei or whatever it is, that you're allowed to sell once and use its money to then subsequently buy stuff for the Beis Hamikdash. But on the first place, to use Beis Hamikdash stuff, to purchase things on the wholesale market and turn around and sell it retail to deliberately make a profit, that already is business. You can't use the money like that. And Rabbi Yishmael argues with this. Says the Mishnah Vayta 10b2, Moisa HaTeruma, the surplus of the withdrawn Shekalim, Ma'aya Oisimba, what did they do with it? They would use the funds to purchase the gold sheets to cover the Kodesh HaKadosh, the Holy of Holies. Rabbi Shmuel Amar, no. Moisa Paris, the remainder that comes from the profits, from those profits that Rabbi Yishmael allowed us to do, to go ahead, because Rabbi Yishmael said, Moisa Shior Leschus, you bought wine, oil, and fine flour, and then you resold it as a retail and made a huge profit. He said, from that profit, you're allowed to do the Ketz HaMizbeach. We used it for the desserts of the Mizbeach, i.e., when the Mizbeach was quiet, the altar was quiet, we brought out additional communal offerings just to bring on the Beis Hamikdash as dessert, so that the Mishkan, the Mizbeach, should never be quiet. Mosa Teruma, L'klei Sharis, the surplus of the actual withdrawn Shekalim from the Trumas Alishcha, we use to purchase and to fix the Klei Sharis. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Moisa Teruma, the surplus of the withdrawn shekalim from the Trumas Alishcha, the leftover from the 3 boxes, that's used l'keit hamizbeach, for the dessert of the mizbeach, because that we need to use the direct shekalim for the purposes of communal offerings. Moisa nesachim, the excess of the nesachim, l'chlei sharis, was used for the service vehicles, the vessels. 10b3. Rav Chananya Tzigana Kehanim Oimer. Rav Chananya Tzigana Kehanim says, Moisa nesachim, the excess of the nesachim is used for the keit hamizbeach, for the dessert of the mizbeach. When the mizbeach is lying quiet, we bring extra behemoths. Moisa teruma l'klei hashares. The moisa teruma goes for the service vehicle, the vessels. Zeh v'zeh, both this and Rabbi Akiva and Rav Chananya, Loyoyim Beperis, did not agree with Rabbi Shmuel regarding fruits, because they said the idea of using shkolim money to buy things on the wholesale market and then turning around and reselling it on the retail market to make a profit and then use it is using money for business. That we do not do. And so they argue vehemently on Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, we're up to the Gemara on Yud Amid Beis on 10b3, and this is where we're going to stop.